Invincible Louisa by Cornelia Meigs. Chapter 6. Kit. The city of Washington lay silent in the raw cold of a cloudy December day, silent and listening. It was almost as if the people walking to and fro in the broad streets were afraid to speak aloud. It was as though they were all straining their ears for a sound just too far off to be actually heard. A great battle was going forward. That was official news, brought to the tall, gaunt man in the White House, who was even now walking up and down the long office room, waiting and listening, just as was everyone else. Rumors were flocking in. General Burnside, the Union commander, was splendidly victorious. General Burnside was in utter rout with all his forces. Rumors of a battle always contradict one another for a little while until finally the truth comes drifting in. The truth came at last. It was news of a signal defeat of the Union troops at Fredericksburg. Close behind it came the rumble of heavy wheels as the ambulances brought the thousands of wounded to the hospitals of Washington. Louisa Alcott's new life as a nurse had just begun. She had not learned very much about her duties as yet. Only which ward was to be hers, how the meals of fat pork and dishwater coffee were served, how many different people must be applied to before an order for bandages and medicine could be filled. The hospital to which she had been sent was in Georgetown, on high ground just outside Washington. The building had once been a large hotel wherein slatternly housekeeping with lazy casual servants had held sway for years. Upon the accumulation of dirt and dilapidation, there had been poured the hasty gathered equipment of a hospital, flimsy iron cots, dingy mattresses, hard pillows, bedding and crockery, and surgeon supplies in all the necessarily enormous quantities. It had looked, nonetheless, like an imposing place to Louisa, as she drove up in the dark, saw the rows of lighted windows and the guards at the door. The recollection of her travels was still like a great adventure upon her. So unused was she to even so modestly brief a journey as this. May and Julian to see her off in Concord. The night spent in Boston with Cousin Lizzie Wells. A few last pangs of wonder and foreboding. Then Anna and John Pratt saying goodbye before the puffing train bore her southward. From Boston to Washington was an elaborate process in 1862. One journeyed by train to New London, by boat to New York, took another inexpressibly early train from New Jersey, and reached Washington long after dark. She had studied her traveling companions with edification. She had chuckled delightedly over the tribulations of hoop-skirted ladies trying to go to bed in the narrow cabin berths of the steamer. As Philadelphia went past the car windows, she pressed her nose to the pane and wished that she could stop a little and see more of her native city. When she came at last to her journey's end, was carried in a bumping cab over the long drive to Georgetown. When she finally dismounted, stiff with lengthy, uncomfortable traveling, the first sensation which came over her was a wave of terrific shyness. All these strange people, a crowd of men about the doors. How was she to face them? What was she supposed to do first? She walked forward boldly, was admitted, welcomed, and taken to her room. A tiny apartment it was, for which the words bare and dreary would give too rich a description. 2 inhospitable iron beds told her that she was to share it with another nurse. Half the window panes were broken, and, opposite the curtainless opening, the innumerable windows of a great hospital in a church across the way stared in upon her. It was inadequately warmed by a narrow fireplace, in which a pair of bricks supported one end of a log, which, too big for the aperture, extended out into the room and had to be pushed into the fireplace by degrees as the wood burned away. The closet was tiny, full of cockroaches, and loud with the scampering of rats. She was warned at once to leave nothing of value lying about, as both the colored and the white hospital attendants were rapacious thieves. When she was introduced to her duties in the ward, she looked about in dismay at the rows of sagging beds, the dirty floors, the unwashed windows, and the long corridors haunted with evil smells. The comfortable, plain neatness of the house in Concord seemed a thing of which she had dreamed, so remote it appeared to be from this vast, dismal place. But she had come to work, and no matter what the circumstances were, work she would do. There was no lack of it. A nurse had just given out ill, and her place was thrust upon Louisa. so that with no training and with insufficient knowledge she found herself immediately superintendent of a ward containing 40 beds. Those who occupied them were suffering variously from measles, diphtheria, and typhoid. The hospital, nevertheless, was not crowded just then. Most of the patients were recovering to a certain degree, so that the pressure for the first 3 days was not unendurable. She began to get acquainted with her fellow workers, with the faces on the pillows, faces which very soon learned to brighten as she came near. Even without surgical skill or proper knowledge, Louisa was a rare nurse. She might be shy, weary, or sick at heart, but even here she always remained good company. Like the others, she had waited through the long, dark day for news from Fredericksburg and had gone to bed, worn out with apprehension. At 3 o'clock in the morning, she was awakened by the general summons. "The wounded are coming." They came streaming in, filling every vacant bed and cot. Waiting in the halls, laid on pallets on the floor. Those who could walk stood in dismal groups about the stoves. Cold, wet, and dirty, they had been fighting in the rain and mud for 3 days, and when they were hurt, were bundled into the ambulances with only the briefest of emergency treatment. Louisa, who thought that she was used to sickness and nursing, had no experience of anything like this. "What do I do first?" she asked desperately of a superior hurrying past. "Wash them," was the brief reply. So armed with a tin basin, a towel so rough that it might be made of sandpaper, and a cake of brown soap which at home she would have used only for scrubbing the floor, she advanced upon her task. She began with the man in the bed nearest her, a person so covered with dirt that his own family might not have known him. She commenced to draw off his ragged uniform, working easily and gently, as she knew how to do, holding her breath for fear a groan of pain would reproach her efforts. "May your bed above be aisy, darling, for the day's work you are doing," said a rich, cheerful voice. Louisa, hearing it, laughed aloud with relief. Faces on a long row of pillows turned and smiled, and the Irish soldier laughed with her. It was a good beginning. During the first days and nights which followed, she was nothing but a bundle of tired aches, driven somehow by a determined will and a cool head. How much there was to do, and what aimless confusion and lack of management there were to hinder the doing of it. There were calls for her in every direction, and need for help, even amongst those who had no strength to call. At first, all those gray, worn faces looked alike to her, but little by little she began to know her horde of new patients. The cheery Irishman, the querulous, complaining man with a little wound, the big, patient Virginia blacksmith with a mortal one. It was on her first turn of night duty that she became acquainted with the little drummer boy and his friend Kit. As she walked between the beds, through the great candlelit cave, which had once been the hotel ballroom, she caught the noise of stifled crying, a strange sound in that heroic company, where even groans were comparatively rare. In the last bed was the smallest patient in the hospital, Billy, the drummer boy, aged only 12. As Louisa bent over him, he broke into open little boy weeping. "I dreamed that Kit was here, and when I waked up he wasn't." He shook with sobs, as well as with the terrific chill which had waked him. She quieted him as only Louisa really could have known how to do, and presently got his story from him, spoken softly lest the rest of the ward be disturbed. The yellow candle shone down upon his white, drawn, pitifully small face as he looked up at her and told her everything that had happened. Men were so badly needed in the army that the government was obliged to accept boys to beat the rolling drums and blow the bugles. Billy had been the object of envy of all his young friends when he marched away with the regiment, thumping gloriously as they went down the road. He had drummed for long, weary marches, in the hot sun, in the rain and the snow. He had never lagged, though his legs were short and his strength only half that of a real soldier's. He fell ill with fever during the Fredericksburg campaign, and was burning and shivering in his tent when the command came to go into battle. He lay under the wavering canvas, hearkening to the boom of the guns, hearing the cheer of his comrades as they went into action. He could not move, he could only wait and wonder. He thought of each one whom he knew, the one who liked to tease him, the one who gave him good advice, and Kit, splendid Kit, who was his chief friend and the object of his adoration. Would the battle bring harm to Kit? That was his chief thought as he lay there and watched the tent canvas shiver and tremble in the cold wind. What was this he heard now? The sound of feet? Thousands of feet going by the tent, not with the measured tread of marching, but with haste, with running panic. Was this a retreat? Could it possibly be that that General Burnside's army had been forced back by the Johnny Rebs? There was a voice at the tent next door. Someone was standing against the light. It was Kit with the kindly face and strong arms, who had gathered him up from his bed of blankets. On the ground, too weak to ask questions, Billy lay against his friend's shoulder and was carried away in that vast, dreary river of defeat which flowed down all the roads that led from Fredericksburg. More than one voice said near them, "You're hurt yourself, Kit. Let me take him." But his comrade would not give him up. The endless shuffle of weary feet changed finally to the rumble of ambulance wheels, but still the two traveled on. Still Kit's arm was around him. Billy fell into a long sleep of complete exhaustion and wakened only at the hospital door. Was he being lifted? Or he was being lifted, but by whose hands? Was it Kit? Or where was Kit? A battered soldier near him told him as gently as he could that Kit had gone. Billy would have cried out in anguish, but soldiers did not do that. He was one of the regiment. He must take this blow without whimpering. He did. In the hospital, he lay silent and wide-eyed, facing his grief with unwavering spirit. It was the dream which betrayed him. He dreamed that Kit was with him again, that they were sitting together by the bivouac fire, laughing and joking as they had so often done. Kit's warm hand was on his shoulder. His strong voice was speaking just beside him, and suddenly he awoke to the shadowy ward, to the flickering lights from the candles in the glowing stove, to the rows of silent beds. Grief took him unawares, and he wept, stifling the great sobs in his pillow as best he could. It was so that Louisa found him. It was into her ear that he poured out the whole story. For a whole hour she listened and comforted. At last he was cheered and quieted. At last he was dropping to sleep. Louisa leaned back in her chair to rest a minute and drew her breath, for it had taken all her strength and spirit to help the desolate little boy. How tired she was and how long the night. But she could be still for a little now, she thought, and could gather courage again. A step behind her made her start and turn about. A long rifleman from Pennsylvania had risen from his bed and was tramping down the ward, walking in the sleep of pain-ridden fever. She rushed to him and seized him by the arm, protesting and commanding. It was dangerous for him to be walking about with a serious wound. He must get back to bed at once. "I'm going home," he announced, and tramped on. He would neither wake nor listen. Tall Louisa hanging on his arm, as was nothing to his gigantic strength, as he strode onward, repeating steadily, "I'm going home." A huge fellow at the end of the ward, less seriously hurt than some of the others, rose from his blankets and came to her rescue. His powerful arms accomplished what her remonstrances could not, so that finally he led the wanderer back to his own place. Quiet, settled down again, Billy was asleep. The lank Pennsylvanian was drifting into more peaceful dreams, muttering still now and then that he was going home. That was what they all dreamed about in that crowded, ill-smelling place, home. Louisa knew it, for her own thoughts at the back of her mind were always on the clean perfume of pine-covered hills, on the glint of the river between green meadows, on the lighted windows and the friendly houses all along the road. In the brief, free hour between the night watch and the day, she wrote letters to her family, of whom she thought so incessantly. The place that she was in was squalid and dreary. There was no romance in the sights she was seeing now, so she thought, but she was bound that they at home should see it all, just as she was always seeing them in the inner vision of her mind. As the days went by, she wrote and wrote whenever she could snatch a minute, so that they too would become acquainted with the blacksmith John Sully, and little Sergeant Bain, and jolly little Sergeant Bain, with Billy and Kit. She herself had learned to know Kit as well as though he were actually there, even though the knowledge came entirely through the chatter of Billy, who had taken her for his confidant. She was often so tired that the writing wavered on the page, but the picture that she drew in words was always clear. She did not feel as strong and undaunted as she had intended to be. Although she did not know it, she was actually perishing for want of the fresh, bracing air which she had always breathed, of the sparse, wholesome food which she was used to eating. She could have courage to steel her heart against the onslaughts of homesickness and the sight of suffering all about, but she could not steel her body against the poisons of that unhealthy place. She grew daily more thin and pale, but everyone around her was far too busy to notice such a thing. In spite of all she felt, Louisa could be nothing other than herself. The ward which she had in charge resounded in laughter, just as the old house in Concord had done. Here was suffering everywhere, and there were jokes everywhere also, since there is no place where something comic cannot be discovered. Some people thought the mirth unseemly, but the men laughed and loved her. The windows were nailed down, but she wrenched them loose and threw them open for a time every day, quite deaf to the dire prophecies of what the consequences might be. She made beds, carried trays, and dressed wounds, and left her patients chuckling whenever she turned away to a new task. How she managed it she could not have told anyone. She did it by being Louisa. While she was on night duty, she slept half the day and spent the other half going about Washington. She knew that she must have some fresh air and, in spite of weariness, always managed to find enough enterprise for roaming abroad. She had seen so little of the world that she felt she must make the most of this chance. Washington in wartime was a strange, crowded, thrilling place. The endless lines of army wagons crawled through the streets, each drawn by its team of 6 mules. Louisa loved animals and found mules fascinating. They were so unfamiliar and so extraordinarily clever. She would see an astute old beast, tired of pulling, deliberately lie down in the street, as though to die, straight away, bringing about a traffic jam of profane and enraged proportions. A crowd would gather, remedies would be applied, strong remedies such as mule drivers know. The big black animal would lie inert, evidently come to the last of his pulling. Everyone would offer advice, and other mules would stand patiently waiting, watching their fallen comrade, with expressions of mild reproach and surprise. At last, after blocking the activities of the United States government for half an hour, the recumbent mule would change his mind, arise with awkward scramblings, and go cheerfully on his way, as though no small unpleasantness of any kind had occurred. The streets were filled with strolling soldiers, garbed in the bright party-colored uniforms which have no place in war of the present day. White breeches, red fezzes, gold-embroidered coats, little blue jackets which swung over the shoulders. Different regiments had different costumes, each vying with the other for brilliant effect. There would be columns of marching troops in blue-gray caped overcoats, rifles on shoulders, faces set and grim with the memory of what the men had so recently seen. If she did not see him herself, she heard people talking everywhere of the president, who used to go about Washington on horseback amidst all this hurry and bustle, incongruously dressed in his long black coat, ill-fitting trousers, and tall hat, a queer, ungainly figure against the background of all this pomp and circumstance of war. The guards, which he was forced to have, and to which he was so indifferent, would come clattering behind, very magnificent, to make up for the shabbiness of that tall man with a dark-lined, deeply absorbed face who rode ahead. She visited the Capitol, finding it of special interest for a fanatic reason. She had seen a picture of it when she was small and had always, in her mind's eye, taken it for the model of a fairy palace. Cinderella, she so imagined, went to housekeeping with the prince after the glass slipper episode in just such a mansion. She climbed the broad stairs and went in, to be greatly disillusioned. It was big and impressive, but to her eyes, there was no romance here. Congress was not sitting, nor the Senate, so that place was given over to colored janitors, who stood about and gossiped and idly plied, here and there, an intermittent broom. There was an unexpected smell of fresh bread through the whole building, from the huge bakery in the cellar, where loaves were baked from the troops stationed about Washington. The crowded streets were more interesting, where through mud, or dust, or the snow, and amid the casual groups of strolling pigs, there toiled ever forward the long, picturesque, relentless procession of the war. She was changed, finally, to day duty, where the routine went on, always in set order, and always with infinite variations. Breakfast came first, with its innumerable trays and teapots, then bed-making, then the dressing of wounds. There would be no bandages. She would rush all over the building to get an order signed for more. Adhesive tape would be lacking. The orderly who had charge of the supplies would have to be found, would be discovered after long search, drunk in the lower regions, and would have to be told in no uncertain terms to return to his duty. Stout-hearted Louisa could perform this part of her office rather well, and the man would go shambling back to his place with promises of no further backsliding. Some patients would get better, would begin to be spoiled, and demand incessant attention. Some would be worse and have to be watched over constantly. One woman came every day to see her husband, who, as everyone knew but herself, had not long to live. He passed in the night so suddenly that no one had time to send warning to her, and she came in to see him just as usual in the morning. "Why, where is Emmanuel?" she cried out in terror. As she saw the empty cot, men turned their heads, nurses stood still. Who was to tell her? The limping Irish orderly came up and took her gently by the arm. "Sure, they moved him to a better bed. Come with me, dear, while I show you," and he led her away. There were a few others who were regular visitors, and one woman who insisted against all the rules on staying to care for her sick son. She was a thorn in the flesh of the hospital staff, for her sharp, scolding voice could be heard all day, finding fault of every kind with institution and nurses, food and management, since nothing afforded proper service for George. In spite of her small-spirited complaining, however, she showed courage and indefatigable devotion. There was no bed for her, so she slept upon the floor beside her boy's cot, and rose up in the morning more acid and irritable than before. The men made all manner of games for her, some of it of no delicate nature, but she paid no attention and continued with her ministrations. She did some good, for she was a constant joke in the ward. She was an example, though rather an odd one, of persevering loyalty. It was with mixed feelings that they all saw her gather up the convalescent George finally and take him elsewhere. The ward was more peaceful after she was gone, but there was something missing which had been of use, at least, to break the monotony of the days. The languishing lady came to volunteer her services for taking care of dear boys, and was put through a severe catechism without Louisa's hearing. Could she work hard? No. She was always greatly fatigued after an hour or two of effort. Did she find it easy to keep awake at night? Oh dear, she could not do night duty. She was afraid to watch alone, and was all in a tremble at the very thought of a delirious patient. Could she help dress wounds and bathe patients? No. She was very much afraid of infection. She also dropped the fact that she fainted at the sight of blood. There could be little hope that she could eat the food of salt beef and bread, which seemed to be made of straw and sawdust, the sloppy coffee. Her services were not accepted. There was one man of whom the others talked, much even before he arrived. It was John Sully, the giant blacksmith from Virginia. His comrades on the battlefield all told of how John had insisted that others be picked up and carried out and cared for before himself, and so did not come with the first consignment of wounded. They wondered and worried lest he should not be brought to the same place. Louisa went in to look at him, asleep that evening after he finally arrived, a man so tall that his bed had to be lengthened to hold him. His face was splendid and serene, like a great statesman's, she said afterward. She came to know him well, for her presence seemed to help him bear the pain of having his wounds dressed. He was tremendously strong, with a body which had been magnificent before the shells of war had torn it almost to pieces. The surgeon in charge took Louisa aside and laid a duty upon her. It was she who, when the time came, must tell this man that he was to die. She did. A nurse must do as she is told. She sat beside him, wrote his last letters to that family which he had been supporting before the conviction came upon him that he must go to the war. A mother, a younger brother, and sisters. He was taking care of them all. The young brother would have to do it now. He dictated the messages, and as she wrote them down, said only to her, "I hope the answer will come in time for me to see it." They called her in the night to tell her that he was going, and that he wanted her. She stood by, while his dearest comrade of march and battle and campfire said goodbye to him. War makes some terrible things, and some beautiful ones. The most beautiful is the regard of one hard, scarred soldier for another. She felt that she also had lost a beloved friend, when suffering at last relaxed its hold and let him go. She made other friends. She could not fail to make many in this strangely assorted company. One was little Sergeant Bain, who was apt to get into mischief in the ward. Like an idle small boy, his right arm was disabled, but he insisted on writing certain letters himself with his left hand, blushing all the while, and beginning them, as she could not help seeing, "My dearest Jane." She heard all about Jane, finally, and nursed the young lady's adorer back to sufficient health for him to go home to lay his heart before her. She used to tell him stories out of Dickens when the pain was unendurable, and he could always laugh. There was a big German of elaborate manners and enormous heart, who was a great help to her in the ward, who comforted Billy when he was longing for Kit. Billy got well, the German got well, many got well and went away. All of them bade her the most grateful of goodbyes. Some of them kissed her. In spite of all the good that she was doing, things were not going well with Louisa. That feeble lady, who admitted to fainting at the sight of blood, was right in one thing, impotent and silly as she was. She did well to be afraid of infection. It was everywhere in that crowded, unclean place. The vile smells proclaimed it. The close air, the dirt-sodden floors, and the dingy walls. With no respect for persons, it attacked the sick and the wounded, the nurses and the doctors alike. On the first day that she came, Louisa had cared for measles, diphtheria, typhoid, and pneumonia, all in the same room. She was put in charge of her first ward because another nurse had been taken ill. Louisa presently developed such a cold that it seemed as though she were to have pneumonia. That, however, was merely by the way. What she did have was typhoid. The illness came on slowly. Her feet became heavier and heavier. She coughed so that she had to stop and hold to things until the paroxysm was over. She took a walk one day up to the Georgetown Heights above the hospital, where there were woods and paths and a far view over the Potomac. She stood beside a clean, bright-running brook and could hardly believe that this peace and beauty were so near to all that was crowded with pain and terror. It was the last time that she walked abroad. The next day was cold and stormy, and her own strength was at an end. The doctors at last took notice of her state and ordered her to keep to her room. Even now she was not willing to give in. She sat at the window, sewing and writing her letters home. She still wanted those at home to know of the further fortunes of John and the sergeant and Billy. Most of all, she seemed to want them to understand about Kit, whom she had never seen. He had died at the hospital door, but he seemed nonetheless to be the real hero of all that heroic company. She did not speak of how ill she was. Although the weeks had seemed so full and so long, she had only been at the hospital a little more than a month. The 1st of January passed, and with it a tremendous event. Back in September, Abraham Lincoln, amid much criticism and a storm of protest, had issued his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that when the new year began, all slaves in the United States should be forever free. Louisa saw that forever began with the stroke of midnight. Freedom descended upon those thousands who had never dreamed of anything but toiling servitude. Bells rang, jubilant Negroes marched through the streets, shouting, weeping, singing "Glory, Hallelujah." Louisa flung up her window and leaned out to cheer with the rest. The face of that fugitive of whom she had thought ever since her childhood was a ghost in her memory, which could now be laid forever. She became more and more ill, and finally could not rise from her bed. Her room was cold and raw, with the chill and fog coming in through the broken windows. She could hear the rats scurrying in the wall, while all the evil smells of the vast, unsanitary place came pouring in upon her. She lay there, thinking about the work which she could do no more, about the hospital days, about the barren Sundays. Occasionally, a dull, uninterested chaplain preached a hurried sermon to men, every one of them in need of religion, some of them on the edge of eternity, all of them with hearts opened by pain and the ghastly memories of battle. What would it be, she wondered, if Theodore Parker should suddenly be there? How would his strong voice sound, ringing through the crowded, pain-filled room? What if his great knowledge of God could minister to these groping ones? Theodore Parker had been dead nearly 3 years, but she knew still every word he had ever said to help her in her own need. He had given her courage to face some hard things. She could face this. One night she woke suddenly, coughing and cold to the very bones. If the fire had gone completely out, she was helpless to rekindle it. The chilliness meant much misery. Perhaps it might even mean death. She sat up in bed and saw a figure kneeling before the fireplace. It was the surgeon, busy and hard-working all day, but come now to see that she was safe. He had brought an armload of kindling, which he had split himself downstairs, and was whittling shavings for fuel to start the dead fire. He looked about and saw her sitting against the thin pillow, with the inadequate blankets wrapped about her. "You will have to go home," he asserted peremptorily. She shook her head. She had enlisted for 3 months. She could not give up after only one. She hardly remembered now how she had nursed. As her first cases, men with typhoid in that stifling and dirty place. The matron of the hospital was ill with typhoid also. Was thought to be at the point of death, although Louisa did not know it. The Meigs were an obstinate race. Louisa would not go. But home, beautiful and delicious word. She lay down and went to sleep, thinking of it. A week later, she heard the word spoken again. The world around her was a dizzy blur now, through which figures came and went, tending her, bringing her food, which she could not eat, and water, which she drank unendingly. The matron had issued from her bed the peremptory order that Miss Alcott must be taken where she could have better care. Suddenly, to Louisa's bewildered surprise, a face leaned over her, a thin, fine-cut countenance, which, even now, had not lost its look of peaceful and serene dignity. How could her father possibly be there? But it surely was he. This was his own voice saying, "I have come to take you home." Even now, she still refused to go, held by the unreasonable obstinacy of illness. For 5 days Bronson stayed and nursed her. He was a good nurse, with an inexhaustible fund of gentleness and untroubled patience. It did not seem wise to take Louisa away against her will. She tossed and fretted and worried over the work which she had come to do, which now must go on without her. The men would miss her, she lamented, just when she had come to know how best to take care of them. She had surrendered to weakness. Another matter troubled her. There was a rule of the hospital that the rough work of the wards was done by such men as were enough recovered to be up and about. With the lack of system and of any wise management, these convalescents were often ordered to do totally improper tasks. The nurses who had labored to get the wounded really set upon the road to recovery would not endure seeing their good work undone by some blundering order which laid upon a half-well man labor far too hard for him. One soldier, with such a bad heart that he should never have been taken into the army at all, was given heavy trays to carry, made to lift ponderous, helpless men, until the work brought him suddenly into far worse illness than that which he had first come. Another young boy with a badly injured back was put to the duty of scrubbing floors, in spite of the visible agony which it cost him. When this injustice was practiced in her ward, Louisa had a simple remedy. She herself lifted and carried and got down on her knees to scrub the floor, often after 12 hours of intensive all-night duty. As she lay helpless, however, she worried continually over these unfortunates and feared no one would care for them. The days passed. The matron of the hospital, ill with the same malady, died. At last, Louisa was too weak to resist longer, and they prepared to take her away. Everyone came out to see her go, her fellow nurses with comforts, the boys with small presents, a head nurse with a shawl, a Bible, and a final list of sharp, impetuous admonitions, such as had been, for Louisa, a source of mirth and despair ever since she came. All of what was going on about her was nothing to Louisa now. As she was taken down to the waiting carriage, was accompanied to the station by a crowd of friends, and was got, somehow, upon the train. It was possible that Bronson remembered that journey, every hour of it, as long as he lived. But upon Louisa it made no impression. Occasionally she would rouse herself to see faces staring at her, curious or shocked or horrified countenances, taking in her disheveled hair, her flushed cheeks, and her rumpled clothes. There was a pause and some uncomfortable changing about. That was Bronson. Another effort followed. A sight of an agonized, terrified face which looked like her mother's, then a bed, a comfortable bed with cool sheets and a white soft pillow upon which she could at last lay down her aching head. That was home.